Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and with everybody trying to figure out which class they're going to be remaining for the patch 11.1 arriving in just a handful of days, I've already decided that I'm going to continue maining Rogue heading into Season 2. However, the class of Rogue does seem like a very risky option for many players for multiple reasons. We haven't gotten a lot of changes over in the patch 11.1, or a lot of the impactful changes that the community was really hoping for. Our tier sets, while decent at least at first, look good on paper, but doesn't always translate into practice. Plus also Rogue's representation over on the PTR has been abysmally low, which doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. However, while the class is not changing too much heading from Season 1 into Season 2, it still could have a potential competitive edge going forward. And with us not having too much information or data points regarding Rogue's performance in the patch 11.1, I wanted to shine a little bit of a light on the Rogue situation and my experience with it so far, going over what has changed and what hasn't changed and what you can expect out of the class of Rogue for Season 2. Go over all three specs and what could potentially make him a viable option, but also go over which spec is looking like the best option so far heading into this brand new season, at least before the final set of tuning, which I'm thinking Rogue is going to get a lot of at least aura buffs and damage amps as we head into the Season 2 content for the patch 11.1. But as always though, if you guys want to see more regular class updates for the patch 11.1, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. Now, currently heading into Season 2, Rogue will still continue to be my main going forward, mostly because I've been playing this class for a long while. I still enjoy it. I still think that it's in terms of gameplay and the day-to-day interactions of the spec, I think it's still in a pretty decent spot ever since there was a little rework for 11.05. It is a little bit concerning to everybody that's playing Rogue about the lack of changes heading into Season 2. Usually, whenever a class has very little changes, that usually means they're going to be falling behind everybody else that's got some brand new toys, new talents, and an entire refresher to accommodate the playstyle heading into brand new content. So there's definitely a little bit of concern there, but also we haven't seen a lot of Rogue data or representation on the PTR. Like out of all the other classes out there, this one has seen the least amount of data that we could kind of pull from to see how well they're doing. And with me spending a bit of time with Rogue and PTR, I wanted to add up to that data a little bit with my own experiences, my own thoughts, but also to answer the question if the class of Rogue is worth maining in Season 2 and where you might be able to find some potential in this class going forward. I want to go over all three specs of Rogues. There's not to talk about in terms of changes for Assassination, some for Outlaw, and very little for Sub, but at least I want to add some context as to how the specs are playing and feeling so far. With Assassination, you got nothing new. The talents, hero specs, everything stays exactly the same, which is at least means that if you've been playing Assassination in Season 1, there isn't a lot to learn for Season 2. And the way that the tier sets function, which is the only thing that Assassination gets that's different this time around, for Assassin's very RNG and very simplistic. Spells and abilities have a chance to activate Winning Streak like every other melee, increasing the damage of your Envenom, Rupture, and Crimson Tempest by 3%, stacking up to 10 times max. Envenom, Rupture, and Crimson Tempest all have a chance to remove Winning Streak. And with the aforesaid, whenever you lose Winning Streak, you have a chance to gain a maximum stacks of Winning Streaks for a few seconds. These cannot be removed and will have additional effect. This actually has gotten hotfixed recently, so the actual tooltip isn't correct. The tool set is still the same. The Winning Streak is still going to provide you a 3% bonus of damage per stack. The Cash Out, which is the foreset mechanic, has a 66% chance to proc, so 2 in 3 chance of it procking. Sometimes it can still just remove your Winning Streak and there's nothing you can do. You just lose it. And other times you will gain the Cash Out buff, which has got changed slightly. Like there, I just got a Cash Out buff, and the Winning Streak now lasts for roughly 10 seconds, or at least it's supposed to be lasting for roughly 10 seconds. The damage amp for it is 50%, and what it does is kind of allows you to not lose Winning Streak and then continue with a Winning Streak. So there is still a bit of RNG, but RNG right now is at least not as garbage as it was. Literally losing out on the entirety of your Winning Streak and just not being able to get it back and having to re-ramp it up, not ideal. And that still exists for Assassination, but now your chances of having to lose it completely and re-ramp it back up are a lot better. However, I do think that this spec is gonna go through even more tuning. As it stands right now, the only gain that Assassination is really obtaining in Season 2 is a new tier set and higher item level. So we'll likely see the spec continue to see additional damage tunings in order to just bring up their damage. I don't think we're gonna see very specific, like, specified changes like a buff towards bleeds or a buff towards your talons, like maybe Kingsbane or certain other options. I think it'll just be an aura buff, just increasing their damage up a little bit, but keeping the spec for the most part the same. The Assassination as a spec at least does have an advantage above all other rogue specs, and that is its performance within Mythic Plus dungeons because of Caustic Spatter and the amount of cleave and uncapped AoE damage that you can do. Technically, the spec does have a soft cap of 5 targets for Crimson Tempest, as well as 5 targets for Caustic Spatter, but it can deal AoE damage with Phantom Knives and the bleeds and poisons and being able to spread all that rot damage to multiple targets. And there's quite a number of big, large target count pulls in these dungeons in Season 2, which Assassination generally does really well with, while having a lot of this focus damage, as usually in every single one of these big trash bags, there's usually going to be one enemy that's a lot scarier than the rest of the fodder, and Assassination could focus in a lot of that damage into the scariest target, which makes him far more efficient than classes that deal pad AoE damage that just doesn't end up being as impactful. Plus, with the survivability being greatly improved for the Spectre Rogue with Fang being off GCD, but also still having things like Cheat Death, or Cloak of Shadows, or Deathstalker defensive bonuses like with the Bait and Switch with Evasion and Cloak of Shadows, there's still quite a bit of survivability for the spec overall. So Assassination at least is walking into the season, which looks like you're going to be going for probably bigger pulls. You should be able to be pretty competitive in those pulls. And with the amps towards the tier set, it should mean that you should have a little bit more consistent damage, not guaranteed specifically, but a little more consistent output within those AoE pulls. The spec itself still does have a bit of a kiss and a curse mechanic, as it's a big Envenom spec. You are Envenom, not Assassination Rogue, but rather Envenom the spec. A lot of your damage is still going to rely on big Envenom, since Envenom can be juiced up with rapid injection, Envenom can cleave multiple targets, you also have Amplifying Poison together with Dragon Temper Blade, so even more double up on your poison, big Envenom damage, so you're still going to be pressing Envenom, and a lot of your damage will be banking off of Envenom as we have it here. Even hero specs haven't changed too much, where it'll be likely you'll still be playing Deathstalker with Darkest Night for some big, satisfying, but very similar Envenom crits that you saw before. There hasn't been enough changes to make Fatebound better, so unless it just performs better numerically, there's just not that much mechanically that it does that is better from Season 1 heading into Season 2. So with the spec basically staying more or less as it is right now, it isn't in a bad spot specifically, but it is potentially has a ability to be a little more stale. It technically should be well set up because it was decent in Season 1 heading into Season 2. It should continue those strengths, but lack of changes and lack of variations in terms of builds and play, I do think if you've been playing Assassination so far, you're not likely to see a lot of build variety for this spec going forward, which can, I guess, depreciate in some of the fun that a player can have with Assassination, especially if you're hoping to have like some bleed-based build or some kind of bit of more variety. You're still very Envenom focused, and I think because of you being so Envenom heavy, I think I would love to see some kind of a rework for Assassination talent tree, just to have a little bit more of this bleed heaviness to it, or maybe some other cleave capability, or transform your abilities in a variety of different ways, so you can have a little bit more playability. I would also love to see some kind of like an active component for Fate Balance, so that it could have some gameplay aspects instead of just being passive damage, which is fine on its own, but I would have just loved someone to give it a little bit more of a hook to it. Where Deathstalker at least has satisfying Darkest Nights, I would have loved for Fatebound for Assassination to have some kind of a hook or like an interaction with maybe one of your major cooldowns to give you like a big burst or some kind of a buff that you can leverage during a very specific window. Then we have the spec of Outlaw Rogue, which has gotten probably the most amount of changes from the PTR build. Although it's very small changes, and if you're someone who's been maining Outlaw or playing it or have knowledge of the spec, you're probably going to get excited about these. But a new player trying to pick up Outlaw, the spec is not getting easier to play, but it is better once you understand the whole roll the bones mechanic of the spec. Now, I could go into very nitty-gritty details regarding Roll the Bones and why the changes to Outlaw Rogue are very exciting, but I'll try to keep it as basic as possible for anybody who is not super familiar with the spec. Your main mechanic is Roll the Bones. It's one of those buffs that you get to roll every 45 seconds to see what kind of combos you can get. You can get better cooldown reduction for your abilities when you spend combo points. You can get more combo point generation from your basic combo point builders, more crit, more chances for your Sinister Strike to hit the second time, more energy, as well as just a damage buff that also buffs your Blade Flurry, Cleave, and AoE. So very, very simple set of buffs. And you get them in assortment. Sometimes you get them as a 1 buff or a 2 buff or a legendary 5 buff combo. But getting a 2 buff is usually a very low chance. And getting 5 buff is also very, very low. But generally, the more buffs you roll as an Outlaw Rogue, the more damage you do. As every single one of these buffs does add up to your overall damage, since they are decent increases in terms of your performance. Just a single buff is generally almost always not enough. But a 2 buff combo, generally very, very good and very, very strong for you. So what they're doing is increasing your chances of getting 2 buff combo and even a 5 buff combo as the Outlaw Rogue. Talents like Sleight of Hand have been greatly improved. Roll the Bones now has a 20% chance to grant you additional matches, which buffs up the chances of you getting a 5 buff and a 2 buff. Then you have the tier set, which not only increases your damage of dispatch. As you do damage, you have a chance to get Winning Streak. Winning Streak increases the damage of dispatch, stack it up to 5 times. Dispatch has a 15% chance to remove Winning Streak. But also, for set, Roll the Bones has a 40% increased chance of granting additional combat enhancements, and also grants you Winning Streak, allowing you to use Roll the Bones a little more aggressively. And there's a lot of cool elements behind it. But basically the 4 set, which increases your chances of getting more buffs, plus the talent of Sleight of Hand, which gives you a higher chance, plus you can combine it together with Loaded Dice. Some players have started to drop this talent, but when you press Adrenaline Rush, you have a guarantee to at least get 2 buffs available. It gives you very, very low chances of rolling the bones and getting just a single 1 buff. Usually you're going to get 2, and in higher chances you're going to get 5. So your chances to get a 1 buff used to be like 80% chance to get a 1 buff and like a 20% chance to get more. Now it's like a 65% chance of rolling 2 buffs, 17% chance of rolling a 5 buff, up from like 1 or 2%. So it's a lot better, and like a small 18% chance of rolling a 1 buff. So you basically now have a reverse where you have a close to 20% chance of getting a bad buff and like 80% chance of getting something good. Your RNG is a lot better in your favor. Are you gonna get unlucky sometimes and just roll 1 buff? Maybe, but you have things like a guaranteed 2 buff with Loaded Dice, or random buffs that you can just materialize out of thin air through ambushes, Sinister Strikes, and Dispatch for a few seconds, which means that your chances of just sitting on 1 buff are very low. So the spec itself should be swimming in a lot more buffs, which makes you feel faster to play, better cooldown reduction, more combo point building, and it just feels like you're going to be empowered throughout majority of encounters as an Outlaw Rogue. Outside of this RNG adjustments, they also increase your damage by 6%, which is also pretty nice. But also, this Roll the Bones RNG allows us to use Roll the Bones ability very aggressively, because it's part of our cooldown reduction mechanic. Outlaw Rogue has a natural cooldown reduction elements as part of its spec, mostly through a talent of Restless Blades. As we spend combo points into finishers, we reduce the cooldown of many of our abilities. Adrenaline Rush, Between the Eyes, Blade Flurry, Blade Rush, Corrosive Strike, Grapple Hook, all those things are reduced whenever we spend combo points into those finishers. So, if let's say I use a couple of finishers here, you'll see the cooldown of my Roll the Bones cuts down very rapidly, which means I can use it a lot more aggressively since I have a very high chance to roll more than 1 buff if I want to. And what I can even do is I can lock in those buffs with Keep It Rolling, Roll the Bones, and just add additional buffs and use this ability super hyper aggressively. What this allows me to do is a couple of things. One, we have a talent called Supercharger. Whenever we roll the bones, our next finisher will consume more combo points, hitting harder, but also giving us better cooldown reduction. So now that we can use Roll the Bones more aggressively, we should be able to get a lot more value out of Supercharger. So we're using Roll the Bones to amp our damage, not necessarily to get a buff, since we can now use it more aggressively, to just use it just for the damage amp, and we usually will have a really good buff combo every time we roll. Plus, the 4 set also has a mechanic with the 2 set. 2 set allows us to get stacks of Winning Streak. Winning Streak increases the damage of Dispatch. Dispatch has a chance to remove those sets of Winning Streak, but Roll the Bones, for every new buff that we roll, has a chance to add towards Winning Streak past maximum of 5. So if let's say I use Adrenaline Rush and Roll the Bones, Because I rolled a 5 buff, now I have a 9 stacks of winning streak, which means I now have 54% more damage to my dispatch. You can combine that together with other talents like similarly dispatch. Every time you dispatch, it hits harder and costs less energy up till maximum 5 stacks. So 5 stacks times 6% damage amp, 30% more damage. So up to 30% more damage here, up to 54% more damage here, and my dispatch can hit very, very hard. So I guess in a way, you're kind of shifting the thought process of your Outlaw Rogue a little bit. You're not using Roll the Bones to get yourself a good set of buffs, but rather you're looking for those little damage amps from winning streak and getting more stacks to the supercharger and enhancing more of your finishers. So Roll the Bones now is like a damage primer rather than a way for you to fish for buffs, which allows you to use it a lot more aggressively. So if anything to say, the spec is looking like it's going to be improved, not only in the feeling of it, but also in the day-to-day gameplay and the damage output. So it has quite a bit of potential, at least when it comes to PvE content. That being said, Outlaw Rogue is still walking into this season with a hard cap of 8 targets, where most classes have a soft cap of 8 or 5 targets. Outlaw has a hard cap of 8. You can't hit more than 8 targets. And with how many more mobs you're going to be pulling in dungeons at least, Outlaw is going to fall behind when it comes to that raw AoE damage output. It is a lot better in certain instances where you don't have as many enemies to fight, like Theater of Pain. There's going to be a lot of lieutenant enemies, and you'll maybe pull a couple of fodder enemies on top of those lieutenants. But for the most part, you can't do too big of pulls. You want to do very efficient but smaller pulls around those lieutenants, and Outlaw will be highly effective at that specifically. The spec still has really good single target damage. It doesn't have to worry about cooldowns because you're constantly always doing damage at all times. You don't have moments where you have high damage, low damage. You're just constantly doing damage, which generally is really good in a Mythic Plus environment, unless you're playing around certain cooldowns. Generally, Outlaw has the most freedom and flexibility, depending on the dungeon, depending on the content, but it generally has some of the best flexibility around. So there's definitely gains to be made, but also still issues that players would have loved to be solved. Like Dance is still becoming a soft cap would have been amazing, or just making Blade Flurry a soft cap ability rather than a hard cap would have been incredibly good. And if they were to do that, Outlaw would be an incredible spot, probably literally the best spec heading into this season if they did that. But because of this limitation, it's always going to be a little bit of a cast shadow over the spec a little. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more guarantee as which spec of Rogue is likely to be the highest performer, or at least the better choice, Subtlety right now on paper is looking like that spec. And I really do mean on paper, because the past few weeks, a lot of the kit of Subtlety has been super bugged, and there's not a lot of information to really work with to figure out how good the spec is going to be going forward. There's just not enough rogues playing over on the PTR, so the data pool you have is very, very small. That being said, Subtlety has probably the best chances of being the go-to spec for Season 2, mostly because of their strong tier set. Their tier set, like every other rogue spec, is going to be around the ability of Winning Streak, where your abilities have a chance to increase the damage of your Eviscerate, Secret Technique, and Black Powder by 3%, stacking up to 10 times, with all those finishers, Eviscerate, Secret Technique, and Black Powder, all have a chance to remove stacks of Winning Streak. While Shadow Dance is active, you cannot lose stacks of Winning Streak, and you gain them a lot more quickly. And each time you gain a stack of Winning Streak, your Shadow damage is increased by 6% per stack of Winning Streak. So not only do you get more overall damage inside of Dance, you'll get guaranteed output of that Dance window during Dance with those Winning Streak stacks, but also Shadow damage during Winning Streak goes up tremendously. All of your finishers also have a little bit of shadow damage baked into them as well. Like the damage of your Eviscerate, the damage of your Black Powder, all of those things hit a little bit harder with a bit more extra shadow damage. So that shadow damage goes up. The damage of your Shadow Blades also gets increased and goes up by a little bit. Secret Technique, part of the ability, also does shadow damage. Like you do physical damage, but then your Shadow Clones do pure shadow damage. So that also goes up by a little bit. You have little things like Flagellation, which also does shadow damage, and a couple of different components here and there. But for the most part, you just will do a lot more damage, and that shadow damage amplification is significant enough. As for the spec itself, there's just not a lot of class changes. Like your talent tree is exactly the same as it was in Season 1 heading into Season 2. Trickster and Deathstalker are about the same. Technically, Deathstalker is a little better because it deals plague damage, which is a mix of nature and shadow, which does get benefits from your tier set. But it looks like Trickster is still very, very good. Just a very solid single target cleaver playstyle, and opens up new possibilities for the spec of Subtlety, being able to deal good single target damage without having to sacrifice that single target to deal good AoE damage as well. The spec also, like Assassination, has technically uncapped AoE, whether it is with the ability of Shuriken Storm, which is soft cap, but still hits everything around you. Then the ability of Black Powder, also soft cap, but still affects everything around you. You technically have very good AoE big group damage behind the spec, and that is something that's going to be really good in Mythic Plus dungeons. With the Trickster, you also have cleave capabilities with Nimble Flurry, while you have a buff of your Flawless Form. Your auto attacks, backstab, shadow strikes, and eviscerate also strike 7 additional nearby enemies for a portion of normal damage, which gives you cleave, very similar to that of an Outlaw Rogue, but also with Black Powder you have constant AoE, uncapped damage, similar to that of a Assassination to a degree. However, Subtlety is also a very quirky spec, at least so far in 11.1, because your tier set, at least especially the Force bonus, it is so strong that it actually will make sure that you have to AFK for at least 25 seconds during regular gameplay. Because of the tier set and how good it is worth AFKing, literally not pressing any buttons, or at least not using Eviscerate, not using Secret Technique, not using any of your big finishers that could potentially remove a stack of winning streak, and just let those stacks of winning streak bank up all the way to the max, or at least as high as you can, whenever you have Flagellation and Shadow Blades coming back up in about 25 seconds. So, at some point, you actually have to AFK as this spec, and all you can do is just reapply a Rupture, or maybe get yourself a Slice and Dice, which you no longer have to manage anymore. But there's just really not a lot that you can do. You just have to AFK and just not do anything for a good bit of while. But yeah, the AFK portion is jarring. It is weird. It is something I don't really enjoy. The damage you do for AFKing is worth it, but I'm just not really a big fan of that type of downtime. And Subtlety is a spec that generally has a decent bit of downtime to it. It's just part of the spec, part of the playstyle. But this feels like a little bit too much. 25 seconds of just like not being able to eviscerate is a very long time. And I feel like it just generating so many common points, I just can't really spend them on anything at all, and I wish there was some kind of a playstyle around it. But with the tier set and how strong it is, and then with Subtlety and the Flagellation blades and how burst heavy the spec is, it is right now, at least as of this moment, really worth just waiting for all those cooldowns and all those buffs to line up together to do ludicrous damage for a short, 20-second window or so that you have all of, or 15-second window that you have all of these buffs available all at once. But on paper, it does look like at least the competitive spec going forward. Again, we don't have a lot of data in terms of to tell exactly for sure that, yeah, this will be the go-to, just because not a lot of players are playing Rogue on PTR to begin with. But this one on paper could be really, really solid and very, very good, as long as the dungeon or raid environment accounts for their cooldowns and you can find moments to really crank out some numbers. Subtlety might be the spec that players should start at least exploring and looking into ahead of Season 2 content. But as always though, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching and hope you guys did enjoy this video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our community to discuss with literally everybody the newest class updates as we receive more tuning for the patch 11.1. Also, let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.